In this video, we're going to turn these lumber mill scraps into this cutting board. I went through some trial and error on getting these pieces cut up, but I finally make it happen, do a little bit of gluing, and come out with my first ever cutting board. And be sure to stick to the end for my grand example presentation on it. The pieces I used for these came from a local lumber mill that had a huge scrap pile of these already cut to length. I was able to get a whole truck bed load of these for only $10. Most of it was purchased to burn wood in our fire pit, but I did set aside pieces just for this type of thing, and they have been drying for around 6 to 8 months. As you can see, I already had trouble getting through one cut, so this is where I ended up clamping it on the end and using my circular saw to get it through. I thought maybe giving it that flat edge would help it get through along the fence, but I was still having issues with it binding up, so again, use a circular saw. For a lot of it, I had to use the circular saw and the chisel to break apart the pieces. I finally got somewhat smart and used this miter gauge to at least get some straight cuts all the way through on the table saw. There are much better ways to go about this, but for the moment, what I have set up right now, this is what I had to do. Now this old tank of a jointer was actually given to me. It's been a while since it's been used, so the guard doesn't spring back, and it also has a bit of surface rust, which I take care of later. Now here I'm finally getting my first piece of wood done. Now I don't know much about different types of hardwoods, and I found out that I believe was a piece of elm, which is a softer hardwood and it indents very easily, so I did not want to use it for this cutting board. Here I used my palm sander to try to get the surface on this jointer a little smoother. It helped a little bit, but I still will have to work on it later to get it smooth. So this continued my process of going back and forth in between the jointer and the table saw just to get all my pieces of wood down to size. Here is a real-time sample of one of the pieces. I finally had all the pieces done and it was time to send them through my planer. I bought the planer used several months ago and this is the first time I have come to be able to use it. I'm using the planer to make sure that the gluing edge is smooth. After all those edges were smoothed up, they were ready to glue. Just to make sure the cold had no effects on them, I let them set inside for a couple days. I used a bunch of the cheap Harbor Freight clamps for this glue up, and I also let it set this way for a couple of days just to make sure all the glue was cured inside. Here came the most exciting part for me since I had never made anything like this before. Finally getting to plane this down and see the board come alive and all the wood grains that come with it. For each time I planed down my main top surface, I sent the bottom also through without adjusting it just to start getting its side smoothed out also. Here you can see we are getting very close to getting completely even across the whole surface. I just needed to send it through a few more times, but then I started noticing a problem. It seemed as though there was one of the types of wood that was taking out larger chunks from the surface. Being that it was purchased used, I thought maybe that the blades needed to be changed out. The guy I purchased this from actually included a new set of blades with it. So I went through the process of changing these all out and then was very confident about sending it through the planer, but it still kept having that result. So I ended up just using 80 grit sandpaper to bring down that surface all the way to where you couldn't see any of those larger chunks taken out. Next, I followed up with 120 grit sandpaper and used 320 grit as my finished surface. Here I wanted to eye out what roundover bit I wanted to use. Did a test run on a scrap piece of wood and then used the router on the whole top surface. And right here there's a little wobble and I made a mess up with the router bit. So I put on the larger plate to have more stability across the surface, and we're going to fix that mistake later. You can see the mistake I made on this corner I'm going over. Wait just a second. Yep, there it is. Now I'm not sure if this is normal or not, but both sides where it was the end grain I was routing gave it a burnt wood look. I also used the roundover on all four corners. Now back to my mistake I made. I used 320 grit sandpaper and just kept going over it until it totally smoothed out and made it disappear. Looks just like it never happened. I also used that 320 grit on the ends that looked like the burnt wood to take some of the darker color out of it. And after all that, I gave the top one last little sanding with the 320 grit, and it was finally ready to apply some oil. And of all the shots I happened to miss for this project by forgetting to hit record, it was the first initial oiling of the top, looking straight down on it. But here's some last bits that I was putting on before letting it set to dry. After it dried, I put a healthy amount of conditioner on it. And finally, I am super thrilled with the resulting piece. For this being my very first charcuterie / cutting board, I'm kind of surprised by how good it actually turned out. Oh yeah, and that presentation I was talking about, here's a few crackers and some cheese on it as a sample of what it would look like as a charcuterie board.